Beijing just drew a red line, and they're dead serious about enforcing it. I'm Ray McGovern, 27 years inside the CIA. I've watched superpowers dance around each other for decades, testing limits while avoiding direct confrontation. But what's happening with China's ultimatum over Venezuela represents something I've never seen before: a nuclear power openly challenging American military action with demands that could trigger World War III. This isn't diplomatic protest. This is the moment when regional crisis becomes global confrontation between superpowers with incompatible strategic objectives and nuclear arsenals pointed at each other. The power struggle starts now, and there's no going back. Let me explain how Venezuela became the flashpoint for the next world war. When Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi delivered Beijing's ultimatum demanding immediate release of President Maduro and withdrawal of American forces from Venezuelan territory, he wasn't engaging in routine diplomatic theater. His language was precise, his deadline was specific, and his threats were backed by military capabilities that could devastate American interests worldwide. The forced capture of a democratically elected leader represents an unacceptable violation of international law that China will not tolerate, Wang declared in an emergency press conference that bypassed normal diplomatic channels. American military forces must withdraw from Venezuelan territory within 72 hours or face consequences that extend far beyond the Western Hemisphere. During my intelligence career, I learned to distinguish between diplomatic posturing and genuine threats. Wang's ultimatum contains specific language that signals Chinese willingness to escalate beyond economic retaliation toward military confrontation if American forces remain in Venezuela. The 72-hour deadline is deliberately short to prevent American consolidation of military gains while demonstrating Chinese determination to challenge American unilateral military action regardless of escalation risks. Chinese demands include not just Maduro's release, but complete American withdrawal from Venezuelan territory, termination of sanctions against Venezuelan government, and restoration of Venezuelan sovereignty over its own natural resources and international relationships. These demands are non-negotiable because they address core Chinese strategic interests in maintaining alternative power centers that resist American hegemonic dominance while protecting Chinese investments that represent future economic security. Beijing's response reflects recognition that successful American regime change in Venezuela would establish precedent for military intervention against any country that maintains partnership with Chinese Belt and Road Initiative or refuses American hegemonic control. The sharp diplomatic backlash triggered by alleged forced capture represents coordinated international response that demonstrates emergence of alternative power bloc capable of challenging American unilateral military action through collective resistance. Russian Foreign Ministry issued simultaneous statement condemning state terrorism while promising appropriate military response to protect Russian interests in Venezuela, including energy investments and military advisors that represent billions in strategic commitments. Iranian government activated defense protocols while threatening to close Strait of Hormuz if American military action against Venezuela triggers broader pattern of regime change operations against countries that maintain independent foreign policies. Cuban leadership placed military forces on highest alert while coordinating with Venezuelan resistance forces that could sustain guerrilla warfare indefinitely against American occupation using Cuban intelligence networks and military expertise. The coordinated response demonstrates pre-existing crisis management mechanisms among American adversaries that enable rapid collective action to challenge American unilateral military operations through simultaneous pressure on multiple fronts. European Union expressed grave concern while threatening economic retaliation against American companies involved in Venezuelan regime change operation, demonstrating growing European independence from American foreign policy preferences that serve no European interest. The international coalition opposing American Venezuelan intervention includes nuclear powers with sufficient military capability to impose unacceptable costs on American operations, while demonstrating that American military superiority cannot guarantee success against coordinated resistance. Beijing's warnings over sovereignty violations reflect Chinese recognition that American abandonment of international legal constraints represents existential threat to Chinese development that requires immediate challenge regardless of confrontation risks. Chinese strategic planning assumes that successful American regime change in Venezuela would establish precedent for similar operations against countries that accept Chinese investment or maintain policies that conflict with American hegemonic interests. The Belt and Road Initiative depends on partner countries maintaining sufficient sovereignty to honor long-term infrastructure and energy agreements that provide foundation for Chinese economic security over coming decades. American military intervention that eliminates governmental sovereignty while installing client regimes accountable only to Washington threatens to destroy Chinese development strategy through systematic regime change operations against Chinese partner governments. Chinese officials calculate that challenging American Venezuelan intervention now is less risky than waiting for American regime change capabilities to eliminate Chinese partnerships throughout Asia, Africa, and Latin America through similar military operations. The sovereignty principle represents core Chinese strategic interest because Chinese economic model requires stable governmental relationships that honor international agreements over extended timeframes necessary for infrastructure development and trade relationship cultivation. American demonstration that sovereignty protection disappears whenever Washington decides targeted governments are illegitimate threatens to eliminate legal predictability that Chinese economic expansion requires for sustainable development planning. Beijing's calls to stop regime change efforts represent Chinese determination to establish precedent that unilateral American military intervention will trigger coordinated international resistance that makes such operations prohibitively expensive. Chinese strategy involves imposing sufficient costs on American Venezuelan operation to demonstrate that unilateral regime change triggers consequences that outweigh benefits while encouraging other countries to resist American pressure through alliance with alternative power centers. The cost imposition strategy includes economic retaliation against American commercial interests, military support for Venezuelan resistance, diplomatic isolation of American operations, and coordination with other American adversaries to create multiple simultaneous crises that overwhelm American response capacity. Chinese economic leverage includes control over rare earth minerals essential for American military systems, manufacturing capacity that produces components for American consumer goods, and financial relationships that could destabilize American economic sectors through coordinated retaliation. Military support for Venezuelan resistance could include advanced weapon systems, intelligence sharing, and technological assistance that transforms American occupation into prolonged counterinsurgency operation that drains American resources while providing no strategic benefits. The diplomatic isolation strategy involves coordinating with international institutions to condemn American military intervention while providing alternative economic and security arrangements that reduce global dependence on American-dominated systems. Chinese coordination with Russian and Iranian responses creates multiple pressure points that force American resources to address simultaneous crises rather than focusing overwhelming force on Venezuelan regime change operation. Beyond diplomacy, the core issue involves massive energy, oil, and financial stakes that transform regional shock into wider confrontation between major powers with incompatible economic and strategic interests. Venezuelan oil reserves represent approximately 300 billion barrels, larger than Saudi Arabian reserves and constituting roughly 18% of global petroleum resources that could fundamentally alter energy markets under independent Venezuelan control or Chinese partnership arrangement. Chinese investments in Venezuelan energy infrastructure exceed $60 billion while providing Beijing with strategic foothold in American sphere of influence that challenges Monroe Doctrine principles requiring American hegemonic control over Western Hemisphere resources. Chinese Belt and Road loans to Venezuelan government total approximately $20 billion in infrastructure and energy development projects that provide foundation for long-term economic relationship independent of American-dominated financial systems. American regime change operation threatens to eliminate these investments while transferring Venezuelan energy resources to American control that would strengthen American economic dominance while weakening Chinese energy security planning. The financial stakes include Chinese concerns about debt repayment from Venezuelan government that owns Chinese financial institutions, approximately $18 billion in infrastructure and energy development loans that new American-backed government would likely refuse to honor. Chinese energy security depends on diversified supplier relationships that reduce dependence on Middle Eastern sources controlled by American allies while providing alternative energy arrangements that cannot be disrupted through American economic warfare. Venezuelan Energy Partnership provides Chinese access to Western Hemisphere petroleum resources that reduce transportation costs while establishing precedent for Chinese energy relationships throughout Latin America that serve Chinese long-term economic interests. American control of Venezuelan energy eliminates these Chinese advantages while demonstrating American willingness to use military force to prevent Chinese access to strategic resources, regardless of commercial agreements or international legal frameworks. The economic confrontation extends beyond immediate Venezuelan interests to include broader struggle over global energy markets, financial systems, and trade relationships that determine which power center dominates international economic arrangements. Chinese officials calculate that Venezuelan energy resources under American control would strengthen American capacity for economic warfare against Chinese interests while eliminating Chinese access to alternative energy arrangements necessary for sustainable economic development. The financial dimension includes Chinese concerns that American regime change operations could target any country that accepts Chinese investment, while establishing precedent that Chinese overseas investments lack legal protection against American military intervention. Chinese development strategy requires legal predictability that protects long-term investments from arbitrary seizure through regime change operations that install governments accountable to American rather than partner country interests. The stakes therefore extend far beyond immediate Venezuelan crisis to include fundamental questions about whether international economic relationships can develop independently of American hegemonic control, or whether Chinese expansion requires direct confrontation with American military power. Chinese strategic planners recognize that failure to challenge American Venezuelan intervention would signal Chinese acceptance of American authority to eliminate Chinese partnerships through military force whenever such relationships threaten American strategic interests. The wider confrontation between major powers reflects incompatible visions of international order where American unilateral military action conflicts with Chinese multilateral economic development while creating confrontation dynamics that eliminate peaceful alternatives to great power competition. American strategy assumes permanent technological and military superiority that enables unilateral action to achieve strategic objectives without meaningful international resistance or unacceptable retaliation against American interests. Chinese strategy assumes coordinated international resistance can impose sufficient costs on American unilateral military operations to make such actions politically unsustainable for American domestic audiences, while encouraging diplomatic solutions that recognize legitimate interests of all parties. The strategic incompatibility creates escalation dynamics where American military action triggers Chinese responses that American leaders interpret as unacceptable challenges requiring additional American escalation to maintain credibility of American deterrent threats. Chinese responses to American escalation include measures designed to impose costs while avoiding direct military confrontation, but American interpretation of cost imposition as aggression requiring military response creates conflict spiral that eliminates diplomatic alternatives to great power confrontation. The confrontation dynamics reflect deeper transformation in international order, where emerging multipolar reality conflicts with American determination to maintain unipolar hegemonic dominance through military superiority rather than institutional accommodation of alternative power centers. Venezuelan crisis represents testing ground for whether multipolar international order can emerge through peaceful negotiation or whether transition requires military confrontation between declining hegemon and rising alternative power centers. Chinese ultimatum therefore represents fundamental challenge to American hegemonic authority that requires either American accommodation of multipolar reality or escalation toward military confrontation that could trigger nuclear exchange between superpowers with incompatible strategic objectives. The economic dimensions of great power confrontation create additional escalation pressures through trade warfare, financial system competition, and resource control struggles that militarize commercial relationships while eliminating economic incentives for peaceful coexistence. Chinese threats to restrict rare earth exports, suspend American debt purchases, or coordinate with other American adversaries to abandon dollar-denominated trade represent economic warfare capabilities that could trigger American military responses against Chinese economic interests. American threats to seize Chinese assets, exclude Chinese companies from American markets, or coordinate with allies to isolate Chinese economic relationships represent economic aggression that Chinese leadership might interpret as justifying military responses to protect Chinese economic security. The escalation spiral includes both economic and military dimensions, where economic warfare creates incentives for military responses, while military tensions eliminate economic cooperation that previously provided mutual benefits, reducing confrontation incentives. Venezuelan crisis catalyzes broader great power competition where economic interests, military capabilities, and strategic objectives interact to create confrontation dynamics that overwhelm diplomatic mechanisms for peaceful dispute resolution. Chinese ultimatum represents recognition that Venezuelan intervention threatens core Chinese interests, requiring immediate response regardless of escalation risks, while American policymakers interpret Chinese resistance as unacceptable challenge requiring additional military pressure to maintain American credibility. The confrontation logic eliminates middle ground for compromise solutions while creating incentives for escalation that serve neither side's rational interests but result from strategic interaction between incompatible power projection strategies. Either diplomatic mechanisms emerge that enable great power accommodation within institutional frameworks that constrain military competition, or economic and strategic competition escalates toward military confrontation that threatens civilizational survival through nuclear exchange. The Venezuelan crisis therefore represents turning point where great power competition either transitions toward institutional management or explodes into military confrontation that eliminates peaceful alternatives while creating existential risks for human survival. Time is running out for diplomatic solutions before economic competition and military tensions create confrontation dynamics that become impossible to control through rational decision-making by leaders who understand the catastrophic consequences of great power warfare in nuclear age.